Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to start this evening by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting this evening, and honour all elders, past and present. My name is Steve Meacher, and I'm Chairman of Healesville Environment Watch, Forest Campaigner for Friends of Leadbeater's Possum, and Vice President of My Environment, which are the three organisations that are hosting this evening's event. By way of disclosure, I also must just mention that I am, as of Friday morning, the Australian Greens candidate for the seat of KC, which includes Healesville. But that is not what I'm wearing tonight, but I have to disclose that. So there we go. The sounds that you were hearing as you came in were the sounds of the tall forests of the Central Highlands of Victoria. And those are the sounds that, or those are the forests, sorry, that we are here to talk about tonight and to hear about. You will know that last year there was a court case in the Supreme Court. My Environment, local group against big forests. And in summarising his judgment, this is what His Honour Justice Robert Osborne actually said. The evidence called by My Environment demonstrates a strong case for the overall review of the adequacy of the reserve system intended to protect Leadbeater's possum habitat within the Central Highlands Forest Management Area. The 2009 bushfires have materially changed the circumstances in which the existing system was planned and implemented, and there is, on the evidence, an urgent need to review it. Several people have actually been conducting such a review, and there have been several meetings and quite a lot of progress made. And central to this review has been the information that we know about these forests and about Leadbeater's possum. And much of that information comes from the work of one man. And we're very fortunate this evening to have that very man joining us to give a presentation. Professor David Lindenmayer did his PhD on the ecology of Leadbeater's possum starting in 1983. So he's been working in these forests now for 30 years. He's known as a prolific author. In that time, he's published in peer-reviewed literature around 800 papers. 200 of those on the mountain ash forests, the birds, the beasts, the trees, the Leadbeater's possum. He's published around 35 books, 7 of which have been on the ecology of Leadbeater's possum. He is a member of the Australian Academy of Science, one of the few members who was invited to join the Academy before the age of 50. So clearly an exceptional person, and we are fortunate to have him with us this evening. So please join me in giving Professor David Lindenmayer from Australian National University a hearty Healesville welcome.
Steve, thank you to all those people that have come out tonight to hear about the status of the forest and an alternative vision for what they might look like in the years to come. One issue that I'd like to take with Steve is that it's not me alone, it's actually a team of people that have been very, very much instrumental in the science that's developed over the last 3 decades. And 2 of those are locals, Lockie McBurney and David Blair. They live here, they work in the forest every day, and they collect some of the highest quality data sets that allow us to determine what's really happening in these forests. So the Central Highlands region, probably no need to put the map up. Essentially this area that we see here overlaps largely with the distribution of leadbeater's possum and the Central Highlands mountain ash forest, which is largely the topic that we're going to go through for the next 3/4 of an hour. So this is really quite a large team of people. We now have 37 scientists and support staff working in our group. The Australian National University pays for one of those people, that's myself. All the other staff come from what we call soft money, which is research grants and book royalties and other forms of support. Statistical scientists, the combined expertise here is 144 years across these people. Ross Cunningham, Jeff Wood and others. Senior research scientists that work in the ash forest down here, postgraduate students, etc., etc. So it's a very substantial body of research and science that contributes to what we're going to talk about. We regularly meet to discuss the science, what the science means, why it's important, what it means for the management, and what it means for conservation. So, as Steve indicated, we've worked here since 1983. I'm really sorry about the IT, we'll have to bear with it. We've connected through various community groups, particularly Earthwatch volunteers. We had 28 Earthwatch camps in Marysville over a period of 10 years. I myself have lived in Warburton and Marysville, and I'm connected through the Yarra Valley through my parents-in-law, and my wife grew up in this area as well. I've also worked for an eco-tourist company called Betchart, which is based in San Francisco, and brought people to the Yarra Valley and elsewhere in Victoria, and then through up until northeast Queensland for several years. So I do have a little bit of a background in that area as well. So I'm now disguised as a much older man relative to this photograph. But I think it's really important to understand that forests are long-term things, and it takes a lot of data gathered over many years to gain an understanding of what's really happening in these systems. So what I'm going to present tonight is not something that's just been gleaned off the top of our heads. It's actually very carefully pieced together science. It's been peer-reviewed in some of the most difficult journals in the world to publish, and it really indicates a system in a very, very parlous state that needs some significant restoration of forestry to put it back together again. So we've worked on a lot of different studies over that time. Possums and gliders, obviously. We've looked a lot at large old trees that are critical structures in this system. We've worked a lot on birds and fire, small mammals, beetles, fire and logging, carbon research, fire and land use history. And we're going to talk about this issue because it's very, very critical to the fire issues in this system, forest restoration and post-fire management. So a lot of work, 200 papers, 7 books, a lot of research over a prolonged period of time. I think it's really important to indicate that we have put this work to the blowtorch of our scientific colleagues to get their feedback, to get their peer review on this, to really understand what's going on. This work was summarised in a book a couple of years ago, 25 years of research. There's very little other long-term forest research done in Australia, and very little like this in the rest of the world. In 1996, we wrote a book about the fact that leadbeater's possum and its conservation is a true test case of ecologically sustainable forest management. If we cannot conserve leadbeater's possum in these forests, then we cannot claim that we are doing ecologically sustainable forest management. It was true in 1990 when we first wrote the first article on this. It was true in 1996 when we wrote the book on this, and it's true in 2013. We've also worked on the combination of fire and logging, and in 2008, before the 2009 fires, we wrote a book on post-fire salvage logging. It turned out that within less than a year, this issue of what happens to forests when they're burnt and then logged becomes very significant in terms of what's happening in this system. So in this talk, I want to talk about the status of the system that we're dealing with, these mountain ash forests. Then I want to talk briefly about critical forest restoration strategies. This system is now at a state where we need to think about forest restoration. Quite a different perspective than we would have had 20, 30 years ago. And then I think there's a very important case for rethinking this forest system and beginning to recognise that this is a very important tourist asset, very important to the regional economy, much more important than the money that's delivered back to the economy through the present structure of the paper industry. Let's get to that. So the status of the forest, part one. The loss of old growth forest. Following the 2009 fires, we see 1,871 hectares of mountain ash forest which is unlogged and unburnt. That's 1.16% of the forest estate which is old growth. Prior to European settlement, the number would have been somewhere between 60 to 80%. So we are presently dealing with somewhere between 1/30th to 1/60th and perhaps 1/80th of what the old growth forest estate would have been previously. Alpine ash, just 97 hectares of 31,000 hectares of alpine ash, or 0.31% is old forest. Why does this matter? Old forest has the most carbon stored, old forest produces the most water, old forest produces the largest number of big old trees where you get leadbeater's possum and other species of possums and gliders. That's one of the critical changes in this system. Hardly any old forest remaining. Old forest is also less fire prone than young forest, and we'll get to that. So old forest, the cover of old forest is very important in terms of future fire risks and the fire proneness of this system. So what we want to do here is to go through the spatial cover of forest in the Central Highlands region by disturbance history. And Lockie McBurney has put these slides together from standard data that's available on the forest system. So this is the mountain ash system that we're dealing with here, in green, and in green here. I want you to walk through this with us. These are the ANU monitoring sites, and there's about 170 of these that have been monitored back to the 1980s. The 2009 fire, you can begin to see what's happening in the system. The ANU plots and fire. The vegetation types again with the ANU plots. The leadbeater's reserve system at present, here in blue. Reserve system and fire. And you begin to see that roughly 42% of suitable habitat for leadbeater's possum through the reserve system has been taken out by the fire. Here's the base map. Now we're starting to look at the timber release plan. The timber release plan plus the logging history. The timber release plan plus the logging history and the water catchments in the reserve system. Overlaid with the fire. Overlaid with the 1983 fire. And then you can cut a little area out of this. This is part of the Talangi area with the timber release plan. So my own perspective is I do not want to hear any more rubbish about 1% or 0.8% of the state being logged in any given year. You need some context relative to the forest types that you're dealing with, because otherwise it's a totally misleading statistic. Mountain ash forest has had a severe, long-term period of disturbance through human activity and logging and the interaction of the two. There's no doubt about that. The data layers show that quite clearly. That's the background history. So how has this happened? This has happened through extensive histories of logging in this system. So at the turn of the century, more timber was coming out of Port Melbourne than there was coming out of Seattle. even though that Seattle area has a much larger timber catchment. So this area had an extensive logging history going back over 100 years. And that's been documented in historical accounts, for example, the book Vital Connections, published in 1991. There has been an extensive and intensive logging history through modern clear felling. And you saw the maps to illustrate that. Then there's also been the history of repeated fire. So there's been 10 fire events in the last 100 years. That's an average of 1 every 10 years. Once the forest starts to burn, it's young forest. Younger forest is more fire prone and is more likely to reburn. When the forest reburns, it's likely to be salvage logged, which means it becomes young, it's more likely to reburn. Now we're going to come back to that, but essentially what's happening then is that this young forest that's been logged is more likely to reburn, and the pattern is set from there. That means the system is very unlikely to be able to restore itself to a mature state. Once the forest has been burnt, it's often salvage logged. After the 1939 fires, salvage logging went on until 1960 in one of the most extensive and long-term salvaging operations anywhere in the world. We've looked at this, we wrote a book on this in 2008. So there's been a prolonged history of that kind of disturbance. It's essentially a triple disturbance. Forest is burnt, forest is salvage logged, in many cases it's reburnt to then set the regeneration process. Has major impacts. That's the status of the forest in terms of disturbance history. Now a little bit of science about the possum response to fire. So this focuses on Leadbeater's possum, and this is work that's now in press with the journal Biological Conservation. Publishing anything these days in the scientific literature is very difficult to do. Many processes of having the work reviewed by many different peer reviews to eventually get to the final product. So we have 161 long-term sites where we survey for possums and gliders. And so we surveyed animals prior to the fire, 1997 to 2009, and then immediately after the fire and then up to 2013. So roughly half of these sites, 161 sites, were burned in 2009. About 30% of them were burnt at low to moderate severity, and the remaining 18% were burnt at very high severity. So in many senses we have an ideal experiment. We know where the animals were before the fire, we know where the animals after the fire. We're able to compare sites that are burnt with sites that are unburnt. And the way that we count animals is very labour intensive. We bring out groups of volunteers to the forest. We've had thousands and thousands of volunteers support with this work. We've measured the trees on the sites, we've measured the vegetation on the sites, we watch for animals emerging from the trees, and we identify what species we're dealing with. And this is the most accurate way of determining the numbers of animals in each site over time. So I'm not going to bore you to death with lots of numbers, but essentially what we see is roughly 27% on unburnt sites. Now these sites have been biased towards places where Leadbeater's possum is most likely to occur. On these sites, we actually have one record, 1.3% of a Leadbeater's possum colony on a burnt site. That's over the 5-year period, the 4-year period from 2009 to 2013. The data show that essentially Leadbeater's possum is virtually absent from burnt sites. Really important result. So virtually no Leadbeater's possums on burnt sites, irrespective of how severe the fire was. So even on low severity sites and moderate severity sites, the animal is still absent, particularly those sites where the animal existed prior to the fire. But there's also some other stings in the tail. One is that even on unburnt sites where there's been fire in the surrounding landscape, Leadbeater's possum is unlikely to occur. So this animal is actually far more fire sensitive than we would have anticipated prior to this study. We also know that Leadbeater's possum is very strongly associated with hollow trees. So on the unburnt sites where the animal still occurs, it's significantly more likely to be on those sites with lots of big old trees. And that's an important issue we'll come back to in a moment. So animals are being lost from these sites where they previously occurred. The data on this are unequivocal. The burnt sites, animals are dying on site, plus there's a massive loss of hollow trees. So this is a tree that was at 40 metres standing height prior to the fire, and it's not much taller than I am at the moment. So even on the unburnt sites, animals are lost from those sites where there's been fire in the surrounding landscape. Very sobering result. So this is the normal response that we see on an unburnt site. The probability of occurrence of an animal on a site is here, from low to high, and this is the abundance of hollow trees on a site, and this is the shape of the curve that links those two things. The more trees you get, the greater the probability you get of an animal on a site. We'll see the significance of that relationship in a moment. So Leadbeater's possum has much greater fire sensitivity than we had previously appreciated. Unburnt sites now become critically important for protection if you want to conserve this animal, especially landscapes where there are large areas of unburnt forest. And hollow-bearing trees, HBTs, become critical for protection, which we'll come to next. 43% approximately of suitable Leadbeater's possum habitat is burned. And again, no Leadbeater's possum on moderate or severely burned sites, or even low severity sites, and no Leadbeater's possums on unburnt sites where the surrounding landscape's been burned. That's the status of the animal after the fire. Okay, so we previously talked about the importance of large old trees. These are critical structures in these forests, and you can see that populations of those are collapsing very quickly. So we published a series of papers on this, one in the Public Library of Science, 2012, one in the most difficult journal in the world to publish, in 2012 and 2013, and we have a set of other scientific studies in preparation. We are looking at the dynamics of populations of these trees. Not the animal in this case, but a key habitat resource for this animal. So when David Blair and Lockie McBurney go to our field sites, they map the locations of the trees. You can see the number of trees here, and they measure the vegetation. And every year they go back and they re-measure those trees and look at the condition of those trees to determine whether they're still standing or whether they've fallen over. And so we can look at what's happened pre and post the 2009 fire. So this is some of the data. 1997 to 2012, pre and post fire, 1,100 trees, plus an additional data set from another 32 sites that go back to 1983. That's the information we're working with. The rate at which these big trees collapse. And this is a Leadbeater's possum tree. You can see a trap bracket here where we attached trap brackets when we were originally catching animals in the 1990s. The animals inside this tree are squashed. So this is the way that trees develop in this system. You start with a large intact tree with an intact crown. How do we sort this out? Okay. Right. Start with an intact crown. What happens then, particularly during a drought period, is that the crown dies off and you get these lateral crowns. The tree starts to rot, and then you go through these stages until eventually the tree collapses. Of course, some trees will collapse straight to here without going through all these steps. But you get the idea of this process of gradual decay and eventual collapse of the system. So I'm not going to ask you to remember all the numbers, but essentially what's happening here is that this is the form of the tree that we showed in the previous diagram, right through to collapsed tree over here. And this is the fire severity, no fire, moderate fire, and severe fire. And so what we're actually doing is we're watching as the trees move from 1997 through to 2011-12 as they change their condition. And we measure how many trees have stayed the same, how many trees have moved through these different stages. And what we see is that in the moderate and severe burned areas, lots of fallen trees in this category here. So what's happening is we're seeing a very large pulse of tree collapse after the 2009 fires. So this is the projected change. So here's our data sets to here. And this is the trend curve that we see for the population of hollow trees in this system over time. This assumes that there's no logging or no fire. If we add that through to 2067, which is when the first 1939 regrowth trees first begin to develop hollows. So what we're seeing then is that the existing big old trees are collapsing very quickly, and it's a long time before we see the pulse of new big trees come into the system. The other thing that's important here is that we've seen a large amount of living trees die on the burnt sites, so the fire has killed those trees. Between nearly 60 to 100% of the large dead trees on these sites were totally consumed in the fire, irrespective of whether it was a low severity fire or a high severity fire. So these are trees that are completely burned and consumed. And then even on the unburnt sites, we've lost nearly a quarter of the big trees that have died. So essentially what we saw prior to the 2009 fires was very extreme temperatures, very low levels of rainfall. That led to a big pulse of tree death in this system. No recruitment of new trees in that period between 1983 and 2013. So this is what's happening in this system. And I'll go through this briefly. This is the normal process. A young tree begins to mature, gets to about 120, 150 years old, then it starts to develop cavities, and then it goes through this process of breakup like we saw before. What's happening is that young trees are killed before a fire, or logging takes out trees before they reach maturity. Logging and fire interact. Young forests are more fire-prone. We'll come back to that in a moment. So what this means is that forests are kept at a young age and they never get through to a mature stage where they begin to develop hollows. On this side of the barrier to tree cavity formation, the big trees are being killed by the extreme temperatures, or they're being exposed during logging, or they're killed by fire, and that's rapidly taking out the trees on this side of the equation. So we're having a big barrier to recruitment and an accelerated loss of existing trees. That's a severe problem in terms of the population of large old trees. So we can actually look at this across the mountain ash system as we've got here. And we've got two little pieces that we can cut out of that map and look at it in some detail. And this map shows you the fire, the areas of green forest, the areas of logged forest, and the areas of forest under the TRP, the timber release plan. The little bits of light blue here is old growth, if you look hard. These yellow dots are those two, from these two windows that are cut out of that map. These are our long-term monitoring sites. Here in Talangi, and here down towards Marysville, and that area on the boundary with the Oceanic catchment. And essentially what you see is very rapid rates of tree collapse in these areas, very few trees in the burnt areas. This is moderate severity, this is high severity, this is logged and proposed to be logged. And underneath are the little graphs that show what's going to happen. So we have seen, in summary, very high levels of tree death. The living tree death rate is about 10 times background rate. 10 times background rate. It's significantly higher on logged and regenerated sites. We'll come back to that in a moment. Essentially, exposure and the regeneration burn kills those big trees. Living trees are lost on high fire severity sites. Dead trees, so they're killed by the fire. The dead trees are virtually consumed, and there's no tree recruitment. So essentially, you've got a large tree crisis developing in this system, which is critical when you think about the habitat requirements of some of these animals. So how are the trees being lost? First thing is that fire is consuming these trees, as you can see here. Natural decay from trees that are already quite decayed after the 1939 and 1983 fires. Fire is making this rate of natural tree collapse much faster, but logging effects on these sites are also very significant. So the large trees are either cut during harvesting, they're burnt in regeneration burns, or they're more likely to fall over within the cut area, but also on the adjacent unlogged forest that's next to the clearfell peat. And we have very good data sets on these published in 1990, 1997, 2010 and 2012. And here's some of those data. This is the rate of tree collapse according to the age of the surrounding forest. And it's a highly significant effect. So essentially what this number shows here is that there's 1 in 1,000 chance that that's occurred randomly and not actually due to the things that we were measuring. So there's a huge mismatch between the collapse rate of trees in this system and the relationships that we need to see between the number of these trees and the number of species of possums, or the probability of occurrence of a leadbeater's possum. You can see that these two curves are going in opposite directions. So at the same time that animals need lots of big old trees to survive on sites, we're seeing a very rapid rate of collapse of those same key resources that they need to survive. So you have a large tree crisis developing. We know that large living trees are a key resource. Large trees in log sites are being lost. So there's a critical need to start to protect all the large trees in this system, but also to start thinking about how we're going to recruit more trees in this system. So there's a massive research effort that's gone into looking at this from ANU scientists and postgraduate students, many scientific articles, and there are now clear management issues with leadbeater's possum, large old trees, intact green forest and old forest. So there's a lot to do if leadbeater's possum is going to make it through. If the state is really serious about conserving its faunal emblem, then some serious changes have got to happen. Based on our 30 years of work, we could not stand by and watch our science being ignored. We needed to think about how do you reconstruct and restore a system that's basically in free fall at the moment. And so we've worked very hard to think about how do you reconstruct, how do you restore this system. And this is really important because we see the need for restoration from a biodiversity perspective. Now, our work shows this, and in more recent times, the research conducted by the Victorian Government through the Arthur Rylah Institute 100% confirms what we have found from the last 30 years of work. So the 3-month snapshot study done by the Arthur Rylah Institute overwhelmingly confirms exactly what we've seen for the last 30 years. We will see also in the rest of this talk that there's a need to do forest restoration for fire management reasons to make this forest less fire prone. Very important. We see from other work that's ongoing at the moment and that's been published that these forests are very, very important for carbon storage. These are the most carbon dense forests anywhere in the world. For water supply, and this is a book that my father-in-law has lead authored, very critical for water supply. You now have in Victoria a clear price signal on water that is delivered by the construction of the desal plant. We know from forest hydrology work done over 30 years that logging reduces water yield. Logging reduces water yield in a highly significant way. Anybody that's got teenagers in their house or have ever seen teenagers in their house will know that they consume a large number of resources. They only have to open your fridge door and then vacuum out all the food that's in it. Young trees are doing the same in this system. They're growing at 1 metre per year for the first 70 years. They have massive transpiration rates where they use the water in the soil. It's transpired through the leaves. Young forest uses a large amount of water. Old forest produces a large amount of water. And it takes forest till about 150 years before it's really producing water at the maximum level. For economic benefits via tourism, and there's a substantial body of work that shows that tourism, when the right infrastructure is put in place, has a massive positive multiplier on the right kinds of economic development, community engagement, and the provision of jobs and other forms of service provision. Very important. It's not my field of expertise, but I have had PhD students. Jeanette Stanley is one that's worked on this, and there's a vast body of literature on this to back up those kinds of statements. So we've produced a set of restoration forest principles for this area, and I can provide copies of this document. I've brought 10 with me. I'm happy to leave them behind if people want to follow that through. Every single principle in this document is based on the last 30 years of work. Every single one. This is what we need to do. We need to protect all the known locations of leadbeater's possum. And that 1 kilometre buffer is based on our understanding from work published in 1993 about the effect of the change in the disturbance regimes in the surrounding area of the location of an animal. We need to protect all large old trees. The 100 metre buffer is based on the fall rates that we know for these large trees in this system. We need to widen all streamside reserves because we know that streamside areas and gullies are the places where you're likely to find the largest number of large old trees in this system. We need to increase the area of old forest to at least 30% of every forest block. And we'll come back to why that's really important, but it's critical for fire reasons, it's critical for habitat reasons, and it's critical for water supply reasons. We need to reduce sustained yield of pulp and saw logs quite dramatically. We need to cease clear felling by the end of this year. It's an antiquated system that does... It's an antiquated system that has significant long-term effects on the forest at the individual tree level, at the coop level, and at the landscape level. That work is uncritical. We have worked over many years to look at variable retention harvest scheme. It's been adopted in Tasmania for many, many years. For some reason, Victoria is over a decade behind on this. We need to secure exit packages for timber workers so that they can move out of an industry which is at the moment demonstrably unsustainable. And we need to think about the value and importance of a new national park in the system to create the kinds of economic growth, the kinds of regional infrastructure to rebuild communities in Marysville, rebuild communities elsewhere in this region, and create a win-win outcome for this very important part of the world. So I reiterate, I think that it's very important to think about how this process is done. We have done a lot of work ourselves in plantation landscapes. This is a book from a place called Tumut, west of Canberra, where we have worked in plantation systems for over 15 years. And the value of those plantations for not only sawn timber, but for paper pulp and other kinds of wood products. A very significant industry. This situation reminds me significantly of other environmental crises. I had the good fortune to have to travel to the eastern seaboard of North America and give lectures about salvage logging as a significant issue in that part of the world. And I met many, many dozens of cod fishers, and their response is, why did not Ottawa stop us earlier? And then we would have had a sustainable industry if it had been restructured properly in that time. And this is one of several books that has written about the collapse of this industry. And I'm reminded of this because one of our researchers is a man called Wade Blanchard. And he is from Halifax, Nova Scotia. And he worked for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans on the collapse of the cod industry. And he moved here several years ago, 2010, and he said to me, and I quote, "I cannot believe this. This is like cod on land." And he was watching this system, and he was looking at how much forest, green forest there was. He was looking at the rate of cutting. He was looking at the solar aspect of the industry, and he couldn't believe how quickly we were going to liquidate that resource and essentially lead to the second critically endangered species in this system, which is the saw log side of the industry. So, forest restoration and the need for a national park. And this is most of the remainder of the talk. So this has been outlined in the new set of prescriptions that we updated. We produced the first set in April, and then following feedback from colleagues, both in Australia and overseas, we produced a second version in July. The need for an expanded national park. The key threatening process in this system is industrial clear felling. Mountain ash forest has survived for somewhere between 20 to 60 million years. Leadbeater's possum has survived for 20 million years, thereabouts. The one thing that's changed in the last 100 years is extensive and widespread clear felling. That has fundamentally changed this system in many critical ways that needs to change. We need to have significant areas of forest where that key threatening process is taken out. That is a fundamental principle in ecology, a fundamental principle in conservation science, is you remove the key threatening process and then try to restore the system once that threatening process is removed. Fundamental principle, and that's what we need to do in this system. That's the big driver that's different to the one that's been in the system for the last 20 to 40 million years. We have written books on this. Large ecological reserves are a fundamental plank in any credible conservation strategy. And we say that in many stages. There's only 2 chapters on reserves in this book. The rest is off-reserve management. But the 2 chapters in this focus extensively on the importance of reserves. So why do we need a large ecological reserve? The supporting science is that the prescriptions are deficient presently for the viability of Leadbeater's possum. So the work done by the Arthur Weiler Institute, the work that we did on the viability of Leadbeater's possum in 1995 and published in the book, indicates that the existing reserve system is highly deficient for this animal. It's critical to have extensive areas where the number of threatened processes is reduced. The reserve system needs to connect areas of Leadbeater's possum habitat to facilitate that recolonisation process, and the reserve system needs to be larger than the fire size, so that you have areas of unburnt forest that are left in the advent of a major fire. So my colleague Chris Taylor is going to talk more about that, but there's been a lot of thinking gone into how this reserve will look, where it will be, and why it would be where it is. Okay. The next issue is why we need a large national park is to do with fire risk. And I'll ask you to concentrate carefully on this one because it's quite an important issue in terms of fire risk. And I can indicate to you that not long after the 2009 fires, I was giving a public lecture. I was asked to talk about biodiversity responses to fire, and at the end of the talk, a gentleman stood up and said, if only the forest had been logged, none of those people in Marysville would have died, none of those people in Steeles Creek would have died. I can't believe that you've killed all those people. That was directed directly at me. That was quite difficult to deal with because I lost friends in both places. My response was, I need to go and look at the scientific literature to see what the evidence is. And I can tell you that the evidence is this. In drier forest, logging interventions can make drier forests less fire prone. In wet forests, the opposite occurs. These are wet forests in the boreal regions of Canada, in the wet forests of Western North America, the wet forests of Eastern North America, the forests of Australia, the rainforests of Asia, South America, and elsewhere. There is a significant relationship between logging and fire proneness. So fire and logging are not independent, and these have significant interactions and flow-on effects to biodiversity, carbon, water, etc. So in 2011, we began to realise that this was very important. We developed the concept of a large-scale trap. Immediately after the 2000 fires, David Blair and Lockie McBurney went out into the forest and they measured the severity of the fire on the long-term sites that had been burnt. They were some of the first people back into the forest and they measured fire severity in a very careful way, looking at branch stubs and the consumption of litter, the consumption of the vegetation, and the relationships between the past history of the sites and the severity of the fire are extremely strong. Young logged forests burn at significantly higher severity than older forests that have been unlogged. The data are unequivocal about that. And there are additional studies that are being done presently which further reinforce those outcomes. So there's a cumulative effect across the landscape of adding many cut areas that are more fire prone across those areas, which change the way fire burns in these systems. Logging makes these forests more fire prone. It increases the severity and it changes what we call the spatial contagion, or the way that fire moves through the systems. And this is part of one of those papers where we contrasted an old growth-dominated forest versus a human disturbed landscape that has got logging regrowth, fire regrowth, and then salvage logging. And eventually, if the system becomes highly fire-prone, which it can do, it becomes an acacia-dominated system where you don't have mountain ash at all. So we reviewed this in a journal called Conservation Letters, and we were able to quantify this in a whole range of forests worldwide. Since that paper was published, we have people that have come to us from Kosciuszko National Park, from Bago-Mooragal Alpine Ash Forest in New South Wales, and more recently from Parks Victoria staff in the Wilson's Promontory area, indicating that they believe that they're seeing similar kinds of phenomena. It's a significant issue. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly to us, when you go back and look at the old literature on these forests, you see that other authors dating back to the 1990s and 1960s had described similar kinds of things, except they hadn't quantified it. So young forests burn at much higher severity, and it changes the spatial contagion or pattern of movement of fire in those systems. As I said before, we now have additional, very strong data that underscore that link. There are very significant additional values that will flow from a new national park. Old growth forest yields much more water than young forest, for reasons that we talked about earlier. There's now a clear price signal on water in Victoria as a consequence of the desal plant. This is really work that's been led by Jim Viggers about this in the new book that Jim is about to publish. But I think, most significantly for this area, there's really important regional and community values from a new national park. I think there's a really critical role to create an exciting new name for a place like this. And then I think about the infrastructure that goes with this. And think about the different targets, the different kinds of people that want to experience these kinds of things. So once you give this a motive, evocative new name, Yarra Ranges National Park doesn't quite cut the mustard relative to other names which I think are more befitting of this kind of environment. There are really important ways to connect up existing infrastructure through wineries, chocolateries, art galleries, Healesville Sanctuary, etc., to reconnect the community with the forest that's very important for this area and create a significant piece of infrastructure, sets of infrastructure to bring people to this area to experience what an amazing place it is. Not love it to death, but to create the right sorts of infrastructure that create community development, to create the right kinds of growth, to bring people here to experience what an amazing place it really is. And to connect with a market of 4 million people that are only an hour and a half's drive from the MCG, plus a significant body of people that will come to this area from overseas once they know this kind of infrastructure is set in place for them. You need to leverage key organisations. Parks Victoria, in many respects, has been asleep at the wheel for the last 5 to 10 years in terms of indicating the importance of these kinds of areas to local communities and building the kinds of infrastructure, the walks, the huts, the interpretive material that make people want to come to these kinds of places. And you can steal ideas from other places. That's always a good way to go. Because this model has been tried over and over and over again, and when the right infrastructure is put in place, with the right kinds of vision and the right kinds of ideas, it's successful. So here we have some of the tallest flowering plants in the world, an hour and a half's drive from the MCG. Hardly anybody in Melbourne has any idea about it. Other places have been able to do this remarkably successfully. So this is the Tarhoon Walkway. I took my family and my parents-in-law to this amazing place to look at these kinds of infrastructure to see what it does. And it does amazing things for changing regional areas. The town of Geeveston, some years ago, which I visited repeatedly, was formerly a basket case, and now it's been totally rejuvenated by these kinds of activities. Totally rejuvenated. It's a very special place that people want to come to from all over Tasmania, all over the mainland, and from around the world. And there's other infrastructure that's been developed in these places that's also very exciting. But there are places and examples all over the world. This is part of the Milford Track. DOC, the Department of Conservation in New Zealand, has created extraordinary infrastructure to bring people to New Zealand to do these kinds of things. It's very exciting. We'll be taking our own children there in just a few months' time, and it's a place that people want to go to from around the world to do these kinds of things. We have the same opportunities here to create the same walking infrastructure, the same forest infrastructure, air walks, those kinds of things. People with imagination, people with zeal, people with drive can do these kinds of things and create the excitement of what a wonderful place this area can be. The Larapinta Trail, another example from Australia. This trail in the McDonald Ranges has absolutely, totally and overhauled that part of the Northern Territory. It's very hard to get a place to walk here now because of the bookings. It's an extraordinary piece of infrastructure. Didn't necessarily cost a lot of money, but it's created the vision, the excitement for people who want to go and do this. And if these people can do these kinds of things in their areas, then I can't see why we can't do the same in this very special area. Thank you very much.
David just take a break for 5 minutes while we have our second speaker, but David will be coming back shortly to answer questions. So if you'd like to just take a break, David, thank you. I just noticed in David's slide there, showing Tasmania, Hollybank. The company that runs Hollybank has a zip line there, and those who are local will probably know that there was a plan for a zip line tour in Talangi State Forest, which would have been part of that tourist infrastructure. It was proposed as a project that would offer, I think it was 45 local jobs. And 2 years ago, the proponents met with the community in Talangi, and the community in Talangi was thoroughly behind the project, and it is still basically fossilised. So as David was saying, there seem to be authorities here who are asleep behind the wheel when people wanting to promote and invest in these sorts of opportunities for our communities, and it just isn't happening. And we need to be asking, what is stopping these things going ahead? Why isn't this happening? So that was my little spiel, but our second speaker this evening has been working, as David said, on this proposal for a national park, and it's been important to actually get some planning on what that park's going to look like, where it's going to sit on the landscape, what's going to be within it, what's it going to protect. And one of the people who's been working very hard on this is Dr. Chris Taylor, who is a research fellow at the University of Melbourne and the University of Queensland. And Chris is now going to go through some of the mapping with us, quite briefly, after which David and Chris will answer some questions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to briefly talk about what we and a number of different stakeholders in the community and further afield have been working on at developing a concept and an area that would facilitate a national park that is much needed for this particular area. So as David said, this is quite a unique area. It has the tallest flowering plants in the world. It has a number of other attributes. I've also been hiking this area for the better part of 25 years, and I've hiked in other parts of the world, and what we have here is very easily comparable to some of these other areas like David was talking about in the Northern Territory. So combined with that knowledge, we've looked at a whole number of different data sets to get an idea of where the particular valuable or hotspots in the Central Highlands are that are either protected or exposed to some sort of threatening process, and the need to come in and mitigate those threats so that species like leadbeater's possum and other unique wildlife actually can persist into the future. So to start off with, it's good to get a bit of a historical context and just a lay of the land. So the federal government in the 1990s and a little bit before that came up with a national vegetation inventory system and estimated effectively where the extent of the, what effectively were the vegetation communities across the Australian landscape. Here's a snapshot of that database looking at Melbourne, and the boundary that you see on the screen is the boundary of the Central Highlands Regional Forest and Marine area. So I'm just going to focus on that area. There's more work to be done on other parts of the state, but for tonight's talk, just focusing on the Central Highlands. So what you can see here is the dark green is effectively the montane ash, the mountain ash and alpine ash forest communities with the cool temperate rainforests in. The lighter green is the more open forest, that's your mountain grey gum, messmates, peppermints, and then you've got your more open woodlands and grasslands. Now since settlement, quite a significant area has been cleared. Victoria is one of the most cleared states in the entire country. Also has some of the most ecologically stressed bioregions of any state in Australia. So protecting our remaining areas is absolutely critical. Now, again, what you see is that the mountain ash and alpine ash forests occupy quite a limited range. It's literally on the higher rainfall areas of the Central Highlands area. We see it on the Mount Disappointment Plateau north of Whittlesea, the Kalani, Mount Donaghurang, up through Lake Mountain, Mount Torbrick area, and then across over to the Borwell Plateau. It's effectively concentrated there. The only other part where it's concentrated are the Otway Ranges. The Strzelecki's also once had a large area of mountain ash, but that was largely cleared. So on top of that, we have a reserve system. Now the reserve system wasn't necessarily designed to protect biological values or other values that we hold dear in the forest. A lot of this reserve system is a default from the water catchment network. So what happened in the 1880s, it was discovered that mountain ash forest was producing a lot of high quality water for drinking and for human consumption and other needs. And so the MMBW came in and protected those areas. So that's effectively what has become the Yarra Ranges and the King Lake National Park. It was effectively areas that were commandeered primarily for water catchment. Now, the red that you see here are all the logging coops. Now, David showed a few slides of these. I'd like to sort of show the Borwell Plateau, which wasn't included as well, to clearly indicate that much of the logging is occurring in that mountain ash area. So again, to reiterate what David was saying, it's really important that we develop an adequate reserve system to protect the values in those forests. This is the outline of the fires that burnt in 2009 and 2007, and again, echoing what David said, there's only a very little, only small amount left. And so based on this, we're looking at the forest to identify specific areas